Not everyone with a humble appearance is easily broken. The older man was tall, draped in a faded military jacket, carrying an old duffel bag in one hand and silently stepping into the boarding area. His face was sun-weathered, his eyes deep and serene, as though he'd long grown familiar with life's storms. His name was Miles Bennett, and he was 60 years old. A name few remembered, but one that had once been engraved on the Pentagon's honor wall, struck off not long after. Flight 713 was preparing for takeoff from Atlanta to Seattle. Passengers were boarding in the familiar order of priority. When the announcement came, first-class passengers may now board. Miles stepped forward and held out his ticket. The blonde-head flight attendant Janelle looked at him, then back at the ticket. Her face hardened not because of an error on the ticket, but because she couldn't believe someone like him was standing here with a first-class ticket.
"Sir, are you certain? This is your ticket."
Her voice was steady, but each word sliced through the air. Miles didn't say much. He nodded and extended the ticket toward her. 1A. Janelle repeated louder, as if she wanted others to hear. A few glances from first class began to shift toward them. Some irritated, some curious. A middle-aged man in a suit sitting in the front row smirked and murmured. Probably bought it off Craigslist. The younger flight attendant behind Melissa approached. She looked at the ticket and nodded. That's correct. Seat 1A. But Janelle still didn't soften. She raised an eyebrow, folded the ticket, and said in a falsely gentle voice, "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable in economy." At that moment, the entire cabin seemed to be holding its breath. People waited for a reaction, a rebuttal, an outburst of anger. But he took the ticket, nodding with an oddly gentle grace. "I don't need a big seat to hold on to my dignity." And he turned away. No one paid attention to the silver-haired man sitting in seat 1C. In his hand was a glass of whiskey, not yet empty. His face showed no emotion, but in his eyes was a cold calculation. General George Renshaw, a man who once owed Miles his life, and now was ready to trap him one last time. This flight wasn't just a journey through the sky, it was a chessboard. And every passenger, knowingly or not, had become a piece in a scheme already in motion. Miles padded past the rows of seats, his faded duffel bag swaying with every step. His old army jacket worn at the shoulders and the faded American flag patch on the sleeve were remnants of a time when he had once been called a hero. When he reached row 22, a middle seat between two strangers, he bowed his head and slowly sat down. No complaints, no signs of discomfort. Years of marching through lands filled with stray bullets and falling bombs had taught him a simple lesson. A seat doesn't define a person's worth, but how one sits in it says everything. Less than a minute later, the window seat passenger arrived. A young woman in her early 20s with red curly hair tied in a rushed bun struggled to shove her oversized backpack into the space beneath the seat. Her round face was dotted with sweat, but her eyes sparkled, and her smile was warm. "These seats are made for hobbits," she muttered, then grinned. "Hi, I'm Harper. Looks like we're neighbors for the next few hours." Miles gave a polite nod. Miles Bennett. Harper looked at him a little more closely. Then she said in a softer voice, "I saw what happened. Up in first class. Hard not to." Miles offered a slight smile, his eyes still facing forward. "Don't mind it. Things like that aren't rare." "Not being rare doesn't make it right," Harper replied, her tone tinged with disapproval. She turned away, but it was clear the moment still lingered with her. A little while later, as the flight attendants went through safety procedures, Miles noticed the light from a teenager's phone a few rows ahead. The boy was recording in hidden camera mode, pointing it toward the front of the plane. The angle was oddly professional, too practiced. Miles observed the boy. He said nothing, But he remembered him, and the look in his eyes a mix of excitement and tension. He also noticed 3 other men seated in rows 16 and 17 in the middle section. They had cropped military-style hair, upright posture, and eyes scanning each boarding passenger. Their hands weren't idle like most passengers. They rested near their waists, as if out of habit from a place where weapons were always within reach. One of them, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, deep, cold eyes, glanced at Miles, then gave a small nod. Very slight. Just enough for a trained eye to recognize it, the silent greeting of men who have been through things not meant to be spoken of. Miles nodded back just as subtly. They knew each other even if they had never called each other by name. Meanwhile, another attendant pouring water up front looked up, and it was Janelle. Her gaze swept down the aisle, scanning the crowd as if searching for someone. When she spotted Miles, she turned away but couldn't quite hide her unease. Or was it fear? Suddenly, the cabin lights shifted to a soft hue, signaling the plane was ready for departure. Miles closed his eyes, not from drowsiness, but to focus. His breathing was steady, hands resting on his knees, but his mind was racing, the swapped laptop, the 3 soldiers in the middle section, Renshaw still sipping whiskey a few dozen feet away. And a strange feeling growing in his chest. I wasn't just pulled onto this flight. I was chosen to be here. A minor glitch occurred when the safety video system froze momentarily, the screens flickering for a few seconds. Then came a steady announcement from the captain. We're about to take off. Please check your seatbelts. Flight time will be 4 hours and 32 minutes. The weather is clear. The voice was nothing unusual. But to Miles, a man who had worked in rapid response units and once sensed an ambush from the change in wind direction, it felt unnatural. He opened his eyes, no longer weary but sharpened like an old survival instinct awakened by distant gunfire. He tilted his head toward Harper. Do you know who's flying this plane? Harper raised an eyebrow. No. Why? Miles turned his gaze forward again. Because the pilot's voice sounds more like someone going into battle than someone flying a commercial flight. As the plane's wheels lifted off the ground, Miles Bennett closed his eyes again, not to rest, but to listen. Not everyone would notice, but he could always distinguish between a safe movement and one deliberate like this aircraft. Something was slightly off. The flight path tilted gently northwest instead of due west as scheduled en route to Seattle. 1 degree of deviation, just 1 minute off course, is meaningless to most people. But to someone trained in aerial reconnaissance, it was a red flag. Miles opened his eyes. The plane's engines hummed steadily. The cabin glowed with a dim light. Passengers began to relax, pulling out books, starting movies, and ordering drinks. Everyone seemed to be living in a moment of manufactured peace, eerily similar to the quiet calm before a military storm Miles had once endured in Kandahar. Next to him, Harper was unzipping her backpack to retrieve her headphones when she paused and looked at him. I don't consider myself superstitious, but didn't that earlier incident feel a little off to you? Miles glanced at her, then turned away. What are you studying, law? Junior year. Interning in the Internal Investigations Division at a cybersecurity firm. Miles nodded slightly as if the universe had just sent him a confirmation. Good. Hold on to that intuition, and never ignore what makes you uneasy. Harper looked at him more closely. He didn't seem like an ordinary older man. Even seated between 2 people, his posture was straight, as though he never truly relaxed. Something about this man made Harper feel safe and a little afraid. Ahead, the restroom light blinked on. A passenger made his way to the rear of the plane. Miles happened to catch sight of another man dressed in a gray button-up shirt, carrying a laptop bag, just returning to his seat. But when the man bent down, Miles noticed the bag he took wasn't the same one he had boarded the plane with. The strap wasn't worn, and looked identical in brand and color. One tiny detail gave it away. The logo was stitched off to the right instead of to the left. That kind of thing is never accidental. Miles sat up a little straighter. He didn't act right away, didn't speak, but inside his mind had already launched into analysis mode. He leaned toward Harper, his voice low and steady. "Did you notice the bag swap?" Harper lowered her voice too. The guy went to the restroom and returned with a different bag. Yeah, but why? Miles gripped the armrest tightly. Because that's a known tactic for transporting classified data. Or hazardous materials. Harper froze. She hadn't had time to react before Miles stood up. "I need to check the restroom. I'll go with no. Stay here." Miles walked toward the aircraft's rear as though he needed to stretch his legs. But once inside the lavatory, he locked the door and began checking areas no one usually noticed: the ventilation duct, the light panel, the ceiling seams. And then he saw it. A small device was affixed behind the fan. It had no logo or branding, but he had been trained to identify the antenna attached to the back from afar as a military-grade audio transmitter, the kind used for continuous surveillance via secured frequencies. This flight was no simple journey, and we are the target. Miles didn't remove the device. He knew doing so could trigger a backup mechanism. He closed the panel again, washed his hands, and stepped out as if nothing had happened. Back at his seat, Harper was still staring toward the cabin. Her expression was tense. "I checked briefly. The guy who swapped the bag is sitting beside a woman in business attire, and the old bag is now lying next to her feet." Miles nodded. "Good. Don't touch anything. Just watch." Ahead, the three SEALs exchanged glances quietly. One of them leaned in and whispered something to the other. The second man nodded, and their eyes all turned toward Miles. At that moment, he knew they had seen something too. The scent of danger was now thick in the cabin air. All that remained was to see who would recognize the fire first. The cabin shook slightly as the plane passed through thick air. The engine's hum dropped to a deeper frequency. Miles Bennett didn't look out the window. He was staring elsewhere into memory. A very familiar sound echoed in his head, the distant crack of a sniper rifle overlapped by a partially broken radio transmission from a commander. It was the kind of sound he had once heard with perfect clarity, as intimate as his heartbeat in a smoke-filled night across the scorched sands of northern Sudan in 2020. Back then, Miles still wore the uniform. He was the team leader of a covert U.S. Special Ops unit tasked with a high-risk rescue extract medical personnel, trapped in a small village seized by rebel forces. Everything had to be silent. There was no media. There was no evidence. Intel said there were about 8 people to rescue all American citizens. But when his team touched down, the truth became blindingly clear through the dusty haze. There were more than 40 people in that village, including women and children hiding inside a crumbling church. Miles radioed command. "There are too many civilians. We can't leave them behind." From the other end, a cold voice replied that it was George Renshaw, then still a lieutenant colonel. "That's not your mission. Grab the package. Pull out." Miles paused. In his heart, he heard the screams, saw the eyes of children clinging to their mothers, felt death lurking, all because he'd been ordered to look away. "I'm not leaving them, no matter whose orders they are," he said, still holding the radio eyes on his team, awaiting his decision. Renshaw said nothing more. The radio signal cut off. That night, under gunfire and flames, Miles led the entire group, both the Americans and the villagers, across an old minefield. Some were wounded, some nearly collapsed. But all survived, including Renshaw, who had been severely injured and trapped far from the rest of the unit. Defying a direct order, Miles had returned to drag him out of danger. But a few weeks later, when the military plane returned them to base, Miles received a lightning strike notice. He was under investigation for insubordination, risking information leaks and compromising a strategic mission. Renshaw took the stand as the primary witness in a closed-door hearing, with no press or comrades to defend him. With a voice of pure rationale, he testified that Miles had refused extraction orders endangered the whole unit, and had even shown signs of sharing intel with local factions for cooperation. At the time, no one questioned why Renshaw, the man whose life Miles had saved, chose not to speak in his defense. Miles was stripped of rank medals, revoked, and quietly discharged from Special Forces. Back in the present, Miles opened his eyes. A man like Renshaw wouldn't be on this plane by accident. If he's here, something far bigger than revenge is unfolding. Beside him, Harper was typing something on her phone. She turned to him and whispered, "I found copies of some military files. The name Miles Bennett and the word Sudan came up along with the term clean slate protocol." Miles leaned slightly. "Send it to me." Harper handed over the phone. One of the files was an internal document from the Defense Oversight Committee, not for public eyes. In it, his name was listed under unreliable former servicemen with potential to compromise national interests. But what made his hands still was the name of the project lead, General George Renshaw. Miles handed the phone back. His eyes turned toward the cabin. 3 rows ahead, Janelle, the head flight attendant, stepped into the front section. Something in her shirt pocket was vibrating. She turned away from the passengers and pulled out a device to answer a small black object that was unbranded and not a typical phone. The man in the military jacket. He knows. He's starting to suspect. An electronic voice replied, "We need him to lose control. Bait him into reacting. The rest we'll handle." Miles couldn't hear the exchange, but he knew those eyes, that device in her hand, and the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his chest. Something was in motion. A conspiracy far bigger than himself. And he, whether he liked it or not, had been placed in its center like a pawn, ready to be sacrificed. Harper leaned close to Miles, her eyes fixed on the man who had just swapped bags. A feeling surged inside her, one she had never experienced before, fear, but not for herself, but for those around her. What if he's hiding something in that bag? What should we do? Miles didn't answer right away. He was observing the man and the woman in the business suit sitting next to him where the left-behind bag now rested. To the untrained eye, the bag looked ordinary. But to Miles, too ordinary was suspicious. His years as a reconnaissance specialist had taught him one thing: what the enemy wants to hide, they will try to make look as normal as possible. "Can you get close?" he asked. Harper blinked. "You mean, take it?" "No. Get a good look. See if it has a lock, a USB port, or anything that shouldn't be there." Harper nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt. She bent down as if picking up a water bottle, then smoothly slid into a nearby row close to the bag. From a distance, she looked like just another young passenger rummaging for personal items. She glanced inside and her heart began to pound. "Mr. Bennett," she whispered, returning to her seat. "It has an external port, like an extra hard drive but military grade." Miles tilted his head. "Good. Now wait for the woman to leave the restroom. Drink whatever, then you act. Take the whole bag, no. Just the laptop. But make it look accidental." Harper nodded. She had once helped her father fix computers in their small garage at home. Later, during her cybersecurity internship, she learned to recognize military-grade encryption protocols. She wasn't a hacker, but knew how to read what others tried to hide. Just a few minutes later, the woman stood and left her seat. Harper didn't hesitate. She bent down, pretended to reach for her water bottle, and with a movement as fluid as sleight of hand, she pulled the laptop from the bag, tucked it under her jacket, and returned to her seat. "Here." Miles took it. Beneath his weathered military coat, he opened the lid slightly. The screen lit up not Windows, but a military-style encrypted interface requiring triple-layer authentication. "Can you get in?" Harper bit her lip. "I'll try." She set the laptop on her lap and opened a temporary decoding module. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as if she'd forgotten she was in mid-air inside a cabin full of people unknowingly caught in a deadly chess game. Miles kept his eyes scanning the cabin. He was no longer just an observer. He had entered the game. 10 minutes later, Harper looked up, eyes wide. "I got into a folder. What's in it?" Harper didn't respond. She tilted the screen so he could see. Military strategy maps, troop designations, unit codes, and base numbers were displayed, but none of them were located where they claimed to be. Units marked near the Russian border were stationed in Hawaii. The discrepancy was dangerous. "These are falsified military positions," Miles whispered. "Someone's trying to build a false narrative, to trigger a military reaction." Harper continued, her voice trembling, like creating a justification to start a war. Just then, another folder appeared. Title: Clean Slate, Sudan. Witness Files. Harper clicked it. There, the names of those present during the Sudan operation in 2020 were listed. She saw a familiar name: William Bennett, her father. Harper held her breath. He used to be a medical worker, was rescued during a mission, but he never told us what happened. Miles looked at her. "Your father is someone I tried to save. I remember that face." Harper turned away, unable to hide the glint of tears. "The report says he died because a soldier disobeyed orders and abandoned the team. And that soldier," Miles nodded, "was me." The space between them fell silent. The cramped row suddenly became an expanse no one could fill. Harper turned back, eyes reddened. "Now I understand why you didn't react when they insulted you. You're used to being misunderstood." Miles didn't answer. He was looking toward the front of the plane where Janelle had just exited the first-class section, and this time, she didn't hide the panic in her eyes. "They know we're getting close to the truth." A chime rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We are approaching a patch of mild turbulence." Miles closed his eyes for a second, then turned to Harper. "I don't think we have much time left." The laptop had barely been closed when the next wave of events struck like lightning. A series of soft clicks echoed from the cabin ceiling, and within seconds, oxygen masks dropped from the compartments above. The head flight attendant's voice came over the speaker. "Flat robotic. The aircraft is experiencing a pressure issue. Please put on your oxygen mask and breathe calmly." Harper and Miles looked at each other. No words needed. They both realized this wasn't a real pressure emergency. Miles pulled the mask down but didn't wear it. Instead, he raised the collar of his coat to cover his mouth. Harper followed suit, using her scarf. Their eyes scanned the cabin. Several passengers had already put on masks and were beginning to sway and lose consciousness within seconds. "It's an anesthetic gas," Miles said quickly. "Anyone who inhales will lose control within 30 seconds. At the front of the plane, Janelle walked briskly through the cabin, her eyes scanning like someone waiting for the results. Miles jumped to his feet. "I have to get to the ventilation system. The gas must be pumped in from there." Harper grabbed his arm. "Be careful. If they're staging a terrorist attack, you're the centerpiece of their script." Miles nodded. "Find a way to warn the others, especially the 3 SEALs. They'll understand." He moved quickly down the aisle, heading toward the center compartment. While everyone else panicked and fumbled with their masks, he opened the overhead control panel where auxiliary vents were. His hands felt around the ducts, locating the one with the emergency bypass valve, a secondary gas line he had been trained on in airborne survival drills. His fingers found the blue wire and yanked hard. Snap! The connector disengaged, and within seconds the faint haze leaking from the masks stopped. Below, several passengers were still dazed. Some had blacked out, but the rest, including Harper, remained conscious. and spared by not wearing the masks. Miles returned. Sweat beaded on his brow. He had taken a risk and managed to save at least half the people on board. By now, the 3 SEALs had also left their seats. One of them, broad-shouldered, familiar-eyed, approached Miles and said softly, "We saw everything. Renshaw's on this flight too. Real name, George Renshaw." Miles nodded. "I know. I also know what he's planning." The soldier nodded back. "My name's Jackson. We recognized you from 2020. Sudan. I followed the classified trial and didn't believe it." Miles gripped his hand tightly. "Thank you for still believing in me." Suddenly, a scream rang out from the back of the cabin. A flight attendant had discovered a passenger convulsing after inhaling too much gas. The man was a doctor. Harper ran to him, trying to pull him away from the affected area. The conscious passengers began helping pulling masks off their loved ones. At that moment, Janelle strode up to Miles, no longer hiding behind her professional mask. "What did you do?" "I saved lives. You're interfering with a national security operation. If protecting this country means poisoning its citizens on a plane, then it's not the country I fought for." Janelle clenched her fists, her face torn between panic and shame. She turned and walked away, the device in her hand buzzing non-stop. Miles looked over at Harper, who was helping an older woman gasp for breath. He walked over. "You're doing great. What do we do now?" Miles looked toward the cockpit. A faint light glowed through the door. It remained tightly shut. "I need to know who's flying this plane." "You mean, if Renshaw's in control up there, then all of us, including the truth, are being flown straight into the dark." The cabin began to stabilize. The gas had stopped dispersing, but the shadow of panic still lingered. Those who remained conscious were doing their best to assist the unconscious, raising arms and legs, helping them breathe steadily, even performing CPR on a 10-year-old boy who had collapsed onto his mother's lap. Miles stood in the aisle, eyes locked on the cockpit door, where the fate of 200 people and his honor was being held hostage. Behind him, Harper and the 3 SEAL operatives, Jackson, Lee, and Davis, were processing the data from the laptop they had recovered. A new folder had appeared, triple encrypted, titled Phase 2 Reclamation Flight. Jackson opened the military-grade tablet, entered the decryption commands, and almost instantly a map appeared. Not a civilian airspace map, but a flight path leading to a military airbase, scrubbed from all commercial maps, Site Delta. "They're flying the plane to their base," Harper whispered. "If we land there, all passengers will be seized, news will be suppressed, and every shred of evidence will disappear." Miles clenched the strap of his jacket. He stepped forward, signaling to one of the flight attendants who was still conscious. "Open the internal communication system for me." The attendant hesitated for a second, then nodded. He grabbed the wall-mounted intercom and spoke quickly and clearly. "This is Miles Bennett. I need to speak to the captain." Immediately. No response. He repeated the message. Still silence. Seconds later, the cabin lights flickered briefly. Then, a voice came over the plane's speaker system, deep familiar but masked by artificial distortion. "Dear passengers, for security reasons, the cockpit is now under the control of a federal special authority. Please remain in your seats until the aircraft has landed." Miles recognized that voice instantly, even processed and disguised it was Renshaw. He lowered the intercom and turned to Jackson. "He's in the cockpit. He's running the whole thing. We could force the door," Jackson said, "but it would trigger the entire system. Might even activate countermeasures. We need access to the door, but through a different way." Harper interjected. "I just found an emergency override code on the laptop for situations where the pilot is incapacitated, but it requires fingerprint authentication from a pre-assigned passenger." Miles frowned. "You mean someone has already been authorized to open the cockpit if needed?" Harper nodded. "That person is you." He froze. So, they want me to open it. They've set me up, so they can record it, use it as evidence. They're framing you as a terrorist trying to hijack the cockpit. The air around them thickened. Then we'll use their plan against them. Miles said, his voice firm. I'll open the door not to take the plane, but to turn the truth back on them before it's too late. Jackson nodded. We'll cover you from behind, but only you are allowed to touch the system. Harper handed him a small earpiece linked to the tablet. I'll monitor the system remotely. If anything abnormal happens, I'll cut the signal. Miles took the earpiece and placed it in his right ear. They moved forward, stepping lightly as though walking on glass. The cockpit door loomed closer, and with it his heartbeat pounded like war drums. As his hand touched the door, a small panel lit up. The green light blinked 3 times. Fingerprint verified. The door clicked like a beast preparing to open its mouth. At that moment, Miles knew he was stepping into a space of life and death, not just for himself, but for the truth that had been stolen from him 5 years ago. Ready, Harper whispered in his ear. Miles placed his hand on the latch and murmured, It's time. We switch roles. Click. The cockpit door opened slowly, as if even it were debating whether to let Miles in or keep him forever outside of history. Inside the cramped control room, the dashboard lights illuminated George Renshaw's face, silver hair, crisp suit, and hand resting loosely on the pistol mounted beneath the radar panel. His eyes hadn't changed, cold, sharp, calculating. Beside him, Captain Reynolds sat, frozen hands raised in surrender. Co-pilot Miller's head was bowed, hands still on the yoke. Miles entered unhurried. He closed the door behind him with a soft push. Renshaw smiled, but it never reached his eyes. I figured you couldn't sit quietly down there for long. I only came up here because I don't want to watch anyone else die for your scheme. Scheme. Renshaw shook his head as if hearing an outdated term from a dusty ethics manual. No, Bennett. This is a strategy. This is truth rewritten in blood if necessary. Miles stepped closer. I once saved your life, and you repaid me by destroying mine. Renshaw's smile turned colder. You don't understand. You made me do it. You questioned orders. You made the brass doubt me. And you saved people who didn't deserve saving. Miles gripped the strap of his jacket. I saved lives. You buried them in your reports. Their eyes locked like blades clashing in a narrow space. The plane's engines hummed beneath them like the heartbeat of a nation waiting to see who would prevail. Renshaw remained seated, but his hand brushed the pistol. I have the authority to activate an emergency protocol right now. Report you as attempting a hijack. Those 2 F-22s outside will handle the rest. Miles didn't flinch. Over 100,000 people are watching the live stream, and the data from your laptop has been uploaded, including Operation Reclamation. Renshaw froze, a hairline crack in his mask for a fraction of a second. News spreads fast, George. But truth spreads faster when it has a living witness. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. If I may speak, sir, he said for the first time in hours. I have the override code to regain control. All it takes is someone willing to do the right thing. Miles nodded, eyes still locked on Renshaw. It's time to end this game. Renshaw tightened his grip on the pistol, but he didn't raise it. His eyes no longer held defiance, only a quiet fear of exposure. You don't get it, Bennett. This world, it doesn't reward the ones who do right. It only remembers the ones who win. Miles took another slow step forward. The world doesn't need to remember me, but the people on this plane deserve to live. Renshaw stared at him for a long moment. Then, his hand let go of the gun. Clunk. The pistol hit the floor, the final punctuation mark on a dark chapter of military history. Reynolds immediately handed Miles the override code. He placed his hand on the console, entering the sequence with the precision of someone who once believed in discipline, but now believed in life. The green light lit up. The captain exhaled in relief, reclaiming the controls. The navigation lock was deactivated, and the flight path was redirected back to Denver International Airport. Miles stepped out of the cockpit. Harper and Jackson were waiting. She looked at him and nodded slightly. "We're able to contact air traffic control, and the camera is still rolling." He looked down at the phone screen she held up. 2 million people watching live. The name Miles Bennett had climbed into the global top 5 trending topics. "Good," he said softly. "Then let them see that the truth can fly higher than the lie." The sound of the aircraft's wheels hitting the runway echoed heavily, but firmly. The cabin shook violently, but gradually steadied. A moment of silence stretched out as though the entire plane were holding its breath. Then, applause. Not raucous, not loud, but like a quiet exhale released from the depths of hearts that had just passed through the doorway between life and death. The captain picked up the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely in Denver. Security and medical teams are waiting outside. Please remain in your seats. You will be guided out in order." Miles did not sit. He stood beside the cockpit door, his military jacket wrinkled, dried blood still staining his hand. But he stood tall like a soldier returning from the front, not for a medal, only for justice. Outside, the flashing lights of dozens of ambulances, police cars, and tactical units formed a circle around the Boeing 737. An FBI rapid response team had arrived, along with members of the press being held behind barricades, their camera lenses trained unceasingly on the aircraft. Harper stepped forward and handed Miles her phone. On the screen, the comments scrolled without pause. "We believe in you, Miles Bennett, the forgotten hero. They tried to frame him as a terrorist, but he saved everyone on that flight." She looked up, eyes glistening. "You know, more than 5 million people watched everything live, and the major news outlets are all converging here." Miles looked down the rows of seats where passengers embraced whispered prayers and gave thanks. An older woman, her face weary but radiant, stepped forward and took his hand. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but I know that if it weren't for you, I wouldn't see my grandson again." He nodded and gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you for trusting me." Not everyone ever did. The aircraft door opened. A gust of cold wind swept in. Along with it, a fully armed security detail, led by a silver-haired FBI agent. He stopped before Miles' eyes, scanning him from head to toe. "We received an alert that this was a hijacking, but we also received live footage from at least 7 separate sources showing the opposite." Miles nodded and handed over a USB drive containing all the data from Renshaw's laptop. "Their entire plan is in here, including Operation Reclamation and the trial run conducted on this flight." The agent took it and nodded. "General George Renshaw is currently restrained in the cockpit unharmed," Miles confirmed, but with nothing left to hide. At that moment, Renshaw was escorted out of the cockpit. He had no more dark glasses, no more control. His face now held nothing but a cold stubbornness and the raw loneliness of a man who once believed he was God. Harper watched him and whispered, "He once sat at the top of Olympus, but today, he's just another man dragged back to earth." As Renshaw passed by, Miles didn't look at him with hatred. He only shook his head like closing the final door on a dream that had been broken. Outside the plane, the cameras were rolling. A CNN reporter called out, "Do you have anything to say?" Mr. Bennett Miles looked straight into the lens. "I just want to say, sometimes the truth has to fly 10,000 meters high and nearly get shot down before it can reach people, but it will land if someone holds on to it, just a piece of it, sooner or later." The cameras kept rolling as he turned away, shoulders square. He walked into the crowd, not as a victim, not as a commander, but as a survivor carrying the light of truths too long buried. 2 months after the Flight 303 incident, Miles Bennett was no longer a small line in a dusty military file. It had become a symbol of courage when all others were silent, and of truth in a world full of masks. That morning, the skies over Washington, D.C. were obvious. On the steps of the Capitol, hundreds of reporters gathered. A line of veterans stood at attention, hands over hearts, watching every step of a 60-year-old man in a faded uniform slowly ascending the white marble steps. Miles Bennett. And this time, no one stopped him from walking through the main doors. Inside the hearing chamber, every seat was filled. In the front row sat Harper, face confident, eyes proud. Beside her, her mother clutched her hand tightly. Further back sat the flight survivors who had witnessed what the press would later call the mid-air battle for truth. The presiding senator raised the gavel. The committee hereby opens the federal public hearing on Operation Reclamation and the role of Mr. Miles Bennett in the Flight 303 event. The room fell silent. Miles stood, walked to the microphone, and adjusted his stance. He carried no notes, no statement prepared, and no one had written his defense. His voice rang out deep and steady, like wind through trees. I served in the military for 32 years. In every mission I was taught that duty is an order, but morality is the compass. 5 years ago, I chose to follow that compass, and I lost everything. 2 months ago, I made that choice again, and this time, I reclaimed not just my honor, but the lives of more than 200 people. He looked toward the row where Harper sat. She nodded an unspoken thank you. 5 years delayed from Sudan. If you ask me whether I'd do it again, my answer is yes, even if it meant paying the price. Again. The entire hall stood and applauded, not because he had flown through a political conspiracy, but because he had chosen to keep the light alive when others were ready to extinguish it for power. 3 months later, deep in the Colorado mountains, a new wooden sign was erected, Pathlight Institute, where honor is forged. Miles Bennett stood at the lectern of his very first class. In front of him were more than 30 young men and women veterans, police cadets who had seen the world turn its back on truth and still chose to move forward. Here, he said, you'll learn how to shoot, manage a crisis, and stay calm in danger. But the most important lesson you'll learn when to say no, because sometimes courage isn't charging forward, it's standing still. In front of a mistake the whole world applauds. The wind chimes on the window sang softly in the mountain breeze. A young man raised his hand. Sir, does justice always win? Miles smiled, lowered his head in thought, then replied, not always, but justice always has someone standing for it. And as long as people like that exist, it will never disappear. That afternoon, a package arrived at the center. Miles opened it. Inside was an old photograph. A young, brown-skinned boy standing outside a medical camp in Sudan, wearing a shirt embroidered with the words, Hope lives here. On the back of the photo, just one line, in 2020, you saved my life. Now I'm a doctor. Thank you. Miles placed the photo on his desk. He stepped onto the porch, looking toward the deep green mountains glowing in the sunset. A student walked by and saluted him. Miles returned the salute. This time he did not smile at a man burdened by memory, but of a man who knew. He had lived rightly, because truth always needs someone brave enough to carry the light.